On March 11, 1974, a Japanese soldier emerged from the Philippine jungle armed with a rifle, 500 rounds of ammunition, and hand grenades. The man was ready for war and considered the United States and its allies mortal enemies. He was Hiro Onoda, who for 30 years remained hidden in the jungle, carrying out terrorist attacks in the name of the Japanese Empire. In this installment of military history, we are going to tell you all about the last soldier standing in World War II, and the incredible reasons that led him to spend 3 decades at the forefront. Hiro Onoda was born on March 19, 1922 in Kainan, a province located in the Wakayama Prefecture, Japan. He was born into the bosom of an empire focused entirely on war and territorial expansion. So, from a young age, he received an education that proposed the Japanese archipelago as the nation that should lead Asia. In 1939, when he turned 17, Onoda traveled to occupied China to work, where he spent a long time watching the beginning of World War II as a simple employee. It was in 1942, when he turned 20, that Onoda enlisted in the army to fight against the Allied advance in the Pacific. The man was trained as an intelligence officer by the Futamata Command of the Nakano School. There, he not only completed the process of indoctrination as a loyal servant of the Empire of Japan, but also learned survival tactics and other knowledge that proved vital to him during his nearly 30-year journey. It is important to note how Japanese soldiers were educated and what the culture of the archipelago was. For years, Emperor Hirohito had proclaimed that the nation had to lead a sort of Asian League to counteract the growing influence of the West. The nations of the region had to unite under Japanese leadership in order to grow and flourish. Of course, the underlying idea was that the Japanese were superior to their neighbors, both culturally and militarily. The Asian continent was a sort of living space, and it was their divine right to take advantage of it. In this case, the ideology that the Empire of the Rising Sun promulgated had points of contact with that of the Third Reich. But let us return to the incredible story of Hiro Onoda.
On December 26, 1944, Japanese soldiers landed in 4-man teams on the small island of Lubang in the Philippines. Both his commander and Onoda knew this would be a challenging mission.
As indicated in the video we just watched, at the young age of 22, the intelligence officer was sent to the island of Lubang in the Philippines. Onoda's orders were to conduct guerrilla warfare against the Americans, who were poised to invade. Due to his training, he had the necessary knowledge to carry out sabotage behind enemy lines, and he had also been prepared to survive in hostile environments, such as the wild areas of the Philippines. His orders also included never surrendering under any circumstances, and in the event of being overwhelmed by the enemy front, he was to commit suicide rather than fall into their hands, although this was a last resort. His fate was to continue fighting, unless given clear orders to lay down arms. When Onoda first set foot on the island, he was assigned alongside Japanese soldiers who had been sent there earlier. The officers in the group outranked him and disagreed with Onoda's proposals to carry out surprise attacks on the American front. Despite the intelligence officer's insistence, they refused to cooperate and did not allow him to execute his mission. This highlights a serious lack of communication between the Japanese High Command and their subordinates. Young soldiers were sent to remote areas with specific orders, but upon arrival, they were not provided with the tools to complete their tasks. Meanwhile, the United States was gaining control over increasingly extensive territories in the Pacific and approaching strategically important points in countries near Japan.
The teams that landed on Lubang Island were ordered by their commanders to stop the invasion of American troops as much as possible. To do this, they were to destroy the Lubang airfield and the pier adjacent to the harbor, as well as enemy planes and crews attempting to land.
On February 28, 1945, American troops, along with Allied personnel from the Commonwealth of the Philippines, assaulted the island of Lubang. They had the material and tactical advantage, as the island's occupants did not expect their arrival and were completely caught off guard. Everyone except Hiro Onoda, who had been promoted to lieutenant and had not forgotten his mission. Only the protagonist of this video and 3 other soldiers under his command escaped the hands of the Allies. The rest either died or surrendered to the enemy, painting a bleak picture, but Hiro knew what he had to do. We can mark this point as the beginning of the soldiers' over 30 years of resistance. Onoda continued his campaign, initially living in the mountains with those 3 comrades who stayed by his side. They were Soldier Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka. Life in the jungle was far from easy, especially when it came to food.
Onoda and his subordinates survived in the wilderness, eating bananas, insects, reptiles, coconuts, and whatever they could find. Sometimes the fruits they gathered, and sometimes the rice and animals they stole from the natives.
The team saw huge waves of enemy soldiers arriving, who temporarily planted their flag in Lubang. After a while, they noticed a change in their attitude. Something important had happened within a few months of the landing in February 1945. The first time Onoda and his companions saw a leaflet claiming that the war had ended was in October 1945. The paper read, "The war ended on September 2, 1945. Come down from the mountains." The message was intended for those rebellious civilians and military personnel who had fled into the wilderness to escape potential capture. While the phrase sounded like bait to bite the hook, it was entirely true. By the time Onoda and his companions read the paper, World War II was not only over in Europe, but 2 atomic bombs had already been dropped on Japanese soil, causing an unconditional surrender by the Japanese Empire. Onoda, however, was suspicious of the leaflet, thinking it was Allied propaganda. He assumed that they would not have launched such messages if the war had really ended. That was not the last time that the Allied front tried to communicate that the conflict was over. Towards the end of 1945, leaflets were dropped from airplanes. The papers had an order of surrender and a list of high-ranking Japanese commanders who had yielded to Allied control, including General Tomoyuki Yamashita. At that time, Onoda and his companions had already been in hiding for more than a year, and this leaflet had been the only proof they had that the war had really ended. The group examined it to determine whether it was authentic or not, and decided that it was a hoax to force them to stick their heads out and be annihilated. Beyond honor and the desire to protect the homeland, life in the jungle was extremely hard. The harsh climate, coupled with the lack of food, pushed the survival capabilities of Hiro Onoda and his men to the limit. They had to hunt animals and learn to distinguish poisonous plants from potential food. Such an effort took its toll on loyalties in the chain of command. Not everyone shared Onoda's enthusiasm for following to the letter the orders that had been given to him many months before. One of the 4, young Yuichi Akatsu, left the others in September 1949 and surrendered to the Philippine forces in 1950 after 6 months of wandering on his own.
The desperate Philippine government contacted the Japanese government in 1952 based on information received from the surrendered Akatsu. So, new flyers were printed, but this time with a personal note from the emperor and a photo of the families of the missing soldiers. Notes were written and photos were printed. Then it was distributed by plane.
Despite the joint efforts of both nations, the soldiers came to the conclusion that it was a hoax. The years in hiding continued to accumulate. During that period, expeditions followed one another to try to find them and leave them messages urging them to abandon this absurd battle in a war that only survived in their imagination. By then, the war had ended more than 7 years ago, and Japan was in the midst of reconstruction, with a constant presence of the United States on its territory. The old Japanese Empire, with its traditional customs and its veneration of the figure of the emperor, was mutating into a modern nation that set its sights on the West. While this was happening in the archipelago, in the jungles of the Philippines, the 3 soldiers were trying to carry out their original mission: guerrilla warfare. Onoda and his 2 companions focused their efforts on attacking local fishermen and farmers, understanding that cutting off the food supply was the best way to hit the enemy. This is why they destroyed fishing boats and burned rice fields, a mixture of terrorism and insurgency that soon earned them a new enemy. Now it was neither the Philippine government nor the Americans who wanted to finish off the rebellious Japanese, but the local workers, furious at losing their work tools and their crops. tension escalated to the point that the farmers acquired firearms. As a result, soldier Shimada was shot in the leg during a shootout with local fishermen in June 1953, after which Onoda took care of him for several weeks until he recovered. This was especially complicated because they not only lacked medicine and painkillers, but were also exposed to the harsh conditions of the jungle, with the constant risk of a fatal infection. However, Onoda's medical knowledge was sufficient to save his comrade's life, at least for a time. On May 7, 1954, Shimada was killed by a shot fired by a search party trying to apprehend the Japanese soldiers, following repeated attacks on livestock and crops. On October 19, 1972, Onoda's remaining comrade Kinshichi Kozuka was killed by 2 shots from local police. The confrontation occurred when the rebellious Japanese soldiers were burning rice collected by some farmers. As we mentioned earlier, this was one of the guerrilla activities intended to undermine the supposed strength of the Allies. Although Onoda had been officially declared dead in December 1959, Kozuka's death suggested that it was likely he was still alive, so search parties were sent out, but none succeeded in finding him. While he was burning grain bags and engaging in shootouts with farmers and fishermen, outside in the world, Japan was drawing closer and closer to the United States, following the rise of the Cold War and the space race with the Soviet Union. Let's say that, from his hideout in the jungle, Onoda was quite out of touch with global geopolitics. The soldier would have continued in this way, convinced of his solitary war if it hadn't been for a completely chance encounter. On February 20th, 1974, Onoda encountered a Japanese student named Norio Suzuki, who was traveling the world in search of 3 things: Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the mythical Yeti, a kind of Bigfoot of the Himalayas. Onoda and Suzuki became friends, but the Japanese soldier still refused to surrender, saying that he first needed to receive orders from a superior. The harsh imperial education still had effects on Onoda's mind, making him incapable of making a decision on his own, even though it was clear that the war had ended decades earlier. Fortunately, the student was determined to help him come to his senses. Suzuki returned to Japan with photographs of himself with Onoda as proof of their meeting, and the government located Onoda's superior, Commander Yoshimi Taniguchi, who had become a librarian. Surprised by the news that one of his former subordinates had still not laid down his arms, Taniguchi flew to Lubang on March 9, 1974. Upon arriving in the Philippines, he was taken to the rural area where his former soldier was known to appear, and, using a loudspeaker, announced Japan's defeat and ordered unconditional surrender. According to Onoda himself, after hearing the orders, he thought it was just empty talk and that the commander would later announce the real orders. But as time passed and he saw it was no ruse, he finally understood that they had lost the war. Suddenly, everything turned black. Inside me, the fury of a storm was unleashed. I felt ridiculous for having taken so many precautions and experienced so much tension during the journey to the post. And, what was worse, what had I been doing all those years? Lieutenant Onoda emerged from the jungle nearly 30 years after the end of World War II and accepted his superior's directives. At that moment, he surrendered his uniform and sword, along with his Type 99 Arisaka rifle, still in working condition. He also had 500 cartridges and several hand grenades. The man still had the means to continue that guerrilla warfare.
This is the moment in March 1974 when Lieutenant Hiro Onoda finally walked out of the Philippine jungle, 29 years after the end of World War II. For nearly 3 decades, he had resisted all attempts to persuade him the war was over.
Despite having killed around 30 residents of Lubang Island and engaged in several shootouts with police, the unique circumstances of his case were taken into account, and Onoda was granted a pardon by Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos. The Japan to which Onoda returned was very different from the one he had left 3 decades earlier. His country was now largely opposed to the militarism and imperialism that had dominated history 30 years earlier, conquering large areas of the Pacific by blood and fire. Emperor Hirohito was still in office, but at the head of a constitutional monarchy. Not only that, but he had even lost his divine status. Onoda was so popular after his return that some of his countrymen encouraged him to stand as a candidate for his country's assembly, one of the most important political bodies. He also published an autobiography entitled No Surrender: My 30 Years of War, shortly after his surrender. In those pages, he details his life as a combatant in a war that had long since ended. Next, we will see images filmed during the hero's return to his homeland.
午後2時40分、小野田さんは生まれ故郷の海南市に到着。ここで海南市役所の200メートル手前でバスを降りた小野田さんは手を振りながら歓迎に応えていましたが、熱狂した群衆に取り囲まれ、警官に守られながらの行進。
The country he had left in 1944 no longer existed. In April 1975, following the example of his older brother Tadao, Onoda emigrated from Japan to Brazil, where he focused on cattle ranching. He married in 1976 and took on a leadership role in the local Japanese community. While spending much of the year in Latin America, the Japanese veteran stayed informed about news from his homeland, troubled by cultural degradation and the spread of Western values. The final straw came when he read about a Japanese teenager who murdered his parents in 1980. Shocked by this story, Onoda returned to Japan in 1984 to establish the Onoda Nature School, an educational camp for youth located in various places across Japan. It was an attempt to instill the order and discipline he had received during his military education in the empire. Finally, the veteran passed away on March 19, 2014 in Tokyo at the age of 91. Now, let's listen to one of the last interviews he gave, where he reflects on his efforts in the jungle.
Every Japanese soldier was prepared for death, but as an intelligence officer, I was ordered to conduct guerrilla warfare and not to die. I had to follow my orders as I was a soldier.
The story of Hiro Onoda has become legendary. After all, he was one of the last soldiers of World War II to lay down his arms, and by far the most active of them all. For 3 decades, he was in charge of perpetuating his cause, even when all signs indicated that there was no longer any reason to fight. For some Japanese, he was a symbol of obedience, loyalty, and pride, something that no longer exists on the island. For others, he was a fanatic who wasted his life fighting ghosts, like Don Quixote against windmills. Before we say goodbye, we would like to know your opinion on the matter. Was Hiro Onoda a loyal soldier or a poor fool? Leave us your answer in the comments box. This brings us to the end of the video. If you want to know more fantastic stories about war events in the 20th century, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications to stay up to date with each of our news. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History.